that fulfilled prophecies from books written 1,000 years earlier. The ground shook as David predicted. Tombs opened like Daniel wrote. Darkness covered the land exactly as Amos warned. These signs terrified everyone because they matched Scripture perfectly, too perfectly. But prophets saw even stranger things. The temple's sacred curtain ripping apart, fishing nets so full they nearly broke from massive catches, and 500 people seeing someone who was supposed to be dead. It all began at the exact moment of Jesus took his final breath on the cross, but the moment he died, scary things started happening. The ground beneath everyone's feet started shaking like a frightened animal. People stumbled and grabbed onto whatever they could find as the earth began moving in ways it never had before. The sound was loud. Cracks opened in the ground with noises like thunder rolling across the land. But this thunder came from below instead of above. However, this wasn't just any ordinary earthquake. The rocks were splitting apart in perfect straight lines, as if an invisible giant was slicing through stone with a massive sword. Temple guards who had stood firm through countless battles stumbled and fell as huge stones cracked right down the middle. These were the same men who never showed fear, yet now they grabbed onto walls and pillars to keep from falling. The ground shook so hard that even the strongest buildings swayed back and forth. Inside the temple, something even more shocking happened. The holy curtain that separated people from God's presence began tearing from the very top all the way down to the bottom. No human hand could reach that high. The curtain hung 60 feet above the ground. This wasn't just any piece of cloth either. The curtain was as thick as a man's hand, woven with the finest materials and designed to last for many years. Still, it ripped apart like paper in the wind. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the temple as priests watched in horror. This barrier had kept ordinary people away from God's most sacred place for over 1,000 years. Only the high priest could pass through this curtain, and only once each year. Ancient prophecies had warned about this exact moment. The prophets had written that when the Messiah died, the earth itself would shake with grief. Yet what looked like destruction was actually the greatest victory in history. The torn curtain meant something amazing. Ordinary people could now approach God directly for the first time ever. The earthquake wasn't just the ground moving. It was heaven's announcement that the barrier between God and humanity had been destroyed forever. No more waiting. No more going through priests. No more separation. Before we continue with the next shocking event, we need to make sure you're ready to understand what's coming. Science shows that when people actively engage with new information by commenting, they understand and remember it much better. So comment "I am listening" below if you're ready to hear about the even more incredible things that happened next. This helps your mind stay focused and process these amazing events more deeply. But while the earth shook above, Jesus was already descending to a place no living person had ever returned from. Jesus' spirit had left his body on the cross, but he wasn't heading to heaven yet. Instead, he went down into the realm of the dead, where every soul who had ever was waiting in silence. This shadowy place had never been broken into before. Its gates had held every prisoner since the very beginning of time. Adam and Eve were there. Noah was there. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob waited in that dim place. Every good person who had ever lived and died was trapped behind those massive gates. The underworld was like a huge prison with walls no one could climb and doors no one could open. The good dead had been waiting for thousands of years, wondering if God had forgotten them. They sat in darkness, hoping someday their pain would end. Then everything changed in an instant. Bright light burst through that shadowy prison like lightning exploding in a cave. The dead souls who had been sitting in darkness for centuries suddenly saw something impossible, a glowing figure walking toward them through the gloom. The light was so bright it hurt their eyes, yet they couldn't look away. Ancient good souls who had waited since the world began realized who was coming. This was the promised one they had heard about. The Messiah they had believed in was finally here. But he was supposed to be alive, not dead like them. However, couldn't hold him like it held everyone else. The gates that had never opened before exploded apart like they were made of paper instead of iron. The sound echoed through every corner of that dark place as locks broke and bars bent like twigs. Abraham rose to his feet, his face full of wonder. Moses stood up, remembering all the promises God had made. David lifted his head, knowing his songs of hope had been true. All the faithful dead rose up because their long wait was finally over. Itself was being beaten from the inside out by the one person it couldn't hold. The underworld's prison broke open, and every captive soul was set free in one amazing moment. Chains that had bound them for centuries fell away like dust. The place of the dead had never seen anything like this. Its deepest, strongest prison had been cracked wide open by someone who was supposed to be just another prisoner. But while Jesus was freeing captives in the underworld, his body still lay wrapped in burial cloths, watched over by soldiers who had no idea what was coming. Roman guards stood at attention around the sealed tomb, their armor gleaming in the moonlight. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were battle-hardened veterans who had been trained never to abandon their posts or show fear. Each man had faced enemy armies without backing down. The massive stone that sealed the tomb entrance weighed nearly 2 tons. It had been rolled into place and secured with an official Roman seal. Breaking that seal meant for anyone foolish enough to try. The guards knew their job was simple: make sure no one stole the body and claimed Jesus had risen from the dead. Everything was quiet until suddenly the ground began to shake. Not like the earthquake that had happened when Jesus died, but something different. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then a mighty angel appeared, with a sound like thunder cracking the sky wide open. His face blazed like lightning, and his clothes were white as fresh snow. The angel's presence filled the entire garden with bright light that made the guards' torches look like tiny candles. These battle-hardened soldiers, who had faced enemy armies without backing down, suddenly found themselves shaking like leaves in a fierce storm. Their hands trembled as they dropped their weapons. Their knees buckled beneath them, and they fell backward onto the ground. The angel moved toward the massive stone as if it weighed nothing at all. With one motion, he rolled it away from the tomb entrance. However, the stone wasn't keeping Jesus inside. It was keeping everyone else out until the right moment came for the world to see what had happened. The guards' torches clattered to the ground as they lay there, unable to move or speak. Their faces went pale with shock because they realized they were no longer guarding a sealed tomb. They were staring at an empty cave. The most secure prison in Jerusalem couldn't hold the one who had beaten itself. These professional soldiers, who had never retreated from any battle, were helpless before the power they witnessed. Their training meant nothing. Their weapons were useless. They could only lie there in complete silence. The tomb that was supposed to contain a dead criminal now stood empty, its massive stone, rolled aside like a pebble, had met its match and lost. Meanwhile, his closest followers had no idea their teacher was free. They were too busy hiding in fear. The disciples huddled together in a small room, jumping at every sound they heard outside. They had barred every entrance and blocked every window. No one could get in or out of that room. They had made sure of it. These men were scared the authorities would come for them next. After all, they had been Jesus' closest followers. If the religious leaders had killed their teacher, what would stop them from hunting down his disciples too? They whispered in hushed voices, afraid even to speak too loudly. The doors were made of thick wood, reinforced with iron bars. They had pushed heavy furniture against the walls for extra protection. Every possible entrance was sealed tight. The room felt like a fortress, but it also felt like a prison. Peter sat with his head in his hands, still haunted by how he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times. The other disciples stared at the walls, wondering what would happen to them now. Their dreams of God's kingdom had died on that cross, and now they were hiding like criminals. However, walls and locks mean nothing when you've beaten itself. Without any warning, Jesus suddenly stood among them in the middle of the room. He hadn't opened any door. He hadn't broken through any wall. He hadn't climbed through any window. One moment the room was empty except for the disciples, and the next moment Jesus was there. The disciples jumped back in shock, their hearts pounding like drums in their chests. They thought they were seeing a ghost because dead people don't just appear in locked rooms. Some of them scrambled toward the corners, while others fell to their knees in surprise.
Peace be with you.
Jesus said calmly, but his voice only made them more afraid. They stared at him with amazement, unable to speak or move. This looked like Jesus, but how could it be? They had watched him die on the cross. They had seen the soldiers pierce his side with a spear. Jesus understood their fear and confusion. He held out his hands, showing them the nail wounds that were still visible in his palms. He showed them the wound in his side where the spear had pierced him.
Touch me and see,
he told them.
A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have.
The same body that had died was now alive again, but it could do things no living body had ever done before. Had changed him. He now had power over physical barriers that stopped everyone else. Nothing in creation could limit him anymore. Yet his followers still struggled to believe what they were seeing. But Jesus wasn't finished showing them his power. He had one more impossible thing planned that would happen by the water. Several days later, the disciples returned to what they knew best, fishing. After everything that had happened, they needed something normal, something familiar. Peter, James, John, and the others pushed their boat into the Sea of Galilee as the sun was setting, hoping a night of fishing would help clear their minds. They worked through the entire night, casting their nets again and again. These weren't beginners trying their luck. They were professional fishermen who had been working these waters since they were boys. They knew exactly where to find fish, what time they fed, and how to position their nets for the best catch. Yet as dawn approached, their nets remained empty. Not a single fish, not even a small one. Hours of hard work had produced nothing. Their arms ached from pulling in the heavy nets, but they had nothing to show for their efforts. The sun started rising over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The disciples were exhausted, frustrated, and ready to give up. They had families to feed, but they couldn't catch even one fish. Then they noticed a figure standing on the distant shore. The man called out across the water,
"Friends, haven't you caught any fish?"
"No!" they shouted back, their voices carrying disappointment across the calm water.
"Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some,"
the stranger replied. Peter looked at his companions with raised eyebrows. They had been fishing these waters for years. Why should they listen to someone standing on dry land? However, something about the man's voice sounded familiar, though they couldn't quite place it. Against their better judgment, they decided to try one more time. They dropped their nets on the right side of the boat, just as the stranger had suggested. Right away, the nets bulged with fish. So many fish that the nets stretched to their breaking point. Fish thrashed and splashed as the nets filled beyond anything they had ever seen. The boat tilted dangerously to one side as they struggled to pull in their catch. John's face lit up as recognition dawned on him. He grabbed Peter's arm and whispered urgently, "It's the Lord." Peter didn't wait another second. He jumped into the cold water and swam toward shore as fast as he could, leaving the others to handle the overflowing nets. The boat nearly sank under the weight of fish as they slowly rowed toward the beach. When they reached the shore, they found Jesus waiting for them beside a charcoal fire. Bread and fish were already cooking over the flames, but word of these appearances was spreading fast, and soon a much larger test of faith was about to unfold. Word spread through the countryside like wildfire. Travelers on dusty roads whispered the impossible news to everyone they met. Market vendors stopped their haggling to share what they had heard.
"Jesus is alive,"
people said in hushed, amazed voices. The rumors seemed too incredible to believe, yet they kept growing stronger. Small groups of people began making their way toward a distant hillside where someone had said Jesus would appear. They came from villages and towns across the region, drawn by curiosity and desperate hope. More than 500 ordinary people gathered on that grassy slope. These weren't religious leaders or wealthy merchants. They were farmers with dirt under their fingernails, mothers carrying babies, elderly men leaning on walking sticks, and young people full of questions. Most of them had probably never spoken to each other before, but now they waited together under the open sky. Some had traveled for hours to get there. Others had walked all night, unable to sleep after hearing the news. They sat on rocks or stood in small clusters, talking quietly among themselves. Many kept glancing toward the horizon, wondering if anything would actually happen. Mass hallucinations don't happen to hundreds of people at the same time. However, mass witnesses of impossible things do happen when God steps into human history. Then, He appeared. Jesus stood before the entire crowd at the same time, visible to everyone at once. No one saw Him approach. No one watched Him climb the hill. One moment the hillside held only waiting people, and the next moment Their risen Lord was among them.